She had spent 5 years building her empire. The sleek marble lobby, the custom-designed uniforms, the quiet confidence of the staff, it all belonged to her. But on this night, none of that mattered. A door slammed. A voice, dripping with casual contempt, ordered her out. They didn't see a successful CEO, they saw a disruption. They saw a woman they felt entitled to dismiss. In that moment of humiliation, they sealed their own fate. Because they had no idea who they had just thrown out. What mistake did the entire staff make that cost them everything in just 13 minutes? If this story resonated with you, if you've ever been dismissed, ignored, or made to feel like you don't belong, then this is for you. Don't let this message fade. The city of Atlanta was a canvas of steel and glass, a relentless machine fueled by ambition. And at its very heart operated Amara Cole, a woman who had mastered its language. Her life wasn't defined by luck, it was characterized by discipline. She knew the cost of every victory because she'd paid for it in double, first in effort, then in skepticism. Amara wasn't born into this world of high finance and gleaming hotels. Her story began on the city's south side, where opportunities were rare and doubts were common. But from the moment she first touched a ledger in a high school accounting class, she saw more than numbers, she saw leverage. She saw the quiet, immutable truth of ownership. While others dreamed of success, Amara built it, piece by measured piece. Her signature creation was the Ascend Hotel Group. Not merely a chain, but a symbol. She wanted to build spaces where excellence was mandatory and prejudice was non-existent. The Ascend name was synonymous with modern luxury, and its newest jewel-like flagship towered over the midtown skyline. It was her crowning achievement, a physical testament to a promise kept. On this particular evening, the city seemed to hold its breath. Amara was returning from a grueling negotiation in Miami, her mind still cycling through the terms of a complex merger. For her, the hotel wasn't just an asset, it was a sanctuary. She liked to check in, sometimes anonymously, sometimes simply observing the ecosystem she had created. It was her way of touching the pulse of the machine. Tonight, she planned only a brief stop at the Atlanta flagship. A few hours of quiet work in the penthouse suite, a late-night cup of tea, and an early flight to New York. The itinerary was routine, precise, and utterly predictable. She arrived in a sleek, unmarked car, a deliberate choice. She often shed the trappings of her CEO title as she moved through the property, preferring to see the operation as an ordinary guest would. It kept her staff sharp and her perspective honest. She stepped out onto the polished pavement of the hotel's porte-cochere. The valet, distracted by a noisy arriving limousine, barely glanced her way. This minor, momentary lapse didn't bother her. She had expected efficiency, but not recognition. She paused, taking a deep, satisfied breath of the crisp autumn air. The sight of the Ascend sign, illuminated in cool white light, was always a decisive moment. This is mine, she thought, a quiet reminder of years of relentless effort. Inside the opulent lobby, everything was in its place. The atmosphere was a calculated blend of hushed refinement and subtle energy. Yet, beneath the calm surface, something was off, a ripple of disorganized chatter near the front desk. A young desk clerk, clearly overwhelmed, was arguing with a guest over a misplaced reservation. The manager, Mr. Thorne, was nowhere to be seen. Amara walked toward the elevators, her steps measured, her gaze taking in every detail. She noticed the slight smudge on the glass entrance door, the forgotten coffee cup resting near a decorative plant. Small things, but in a world of 5-star expectations, small things mattered. These tiny fractures were the first hint of the rot beneath the polished veneer. She reached the elevator bank, expecting the familiar deferential nod from the security guard, but found none. Instead, she felt the subtle chilling weight of unwanted attention. She saw 2 front-of-house staff members, a hostess and an older bellman, glance at her, then quickly look away, their conversation suddenly halting. There was an edge to their silence, a judgment she recognized instantly. It wasn't the kind of look reserved for a customer, it was the look reserved for someone they felt didn't belong. Amara kept walking, her face a mask of composed neutrality. She knew this look. She'd spent her entire career navigating rooms where her presence was questioned before her credentials were seen. Usually, in her own buildings, that behavior was unthinkable. Tonight, there was a slight tremor before a quake. She reached the check-in desk, intending to request the key to the reserved owner's suite in a calm manner. Her mind was already drafting a note to Mr. Thorne about procedural deficiencies and the need for stricter adherence to the brand standard. She was ready to be the CEO, stern, fair, and meticulous. But the moment she placed her hand on the marble counter, she felt the air shift. She was about to introduce herself to the clerk. Still, the clerk was already looking past her, eyes narrowed, ready to challenge rather than serve. Amara had prepared for difficult board meetings, hostile takeovers, and market collapses. She was ready for incompetence. She was prepared for errors. She was not ready for the simple toxic arrogance that was about to strip away all her hard-won authority and reduce her to nothing more than a suspicion. The confrontation was seconds away, and she had already decided to observe, to correct, and to move on. What she didn't know was that the staff had already made a critical, irreversible decision about who she was, a decision rooted in prejudice, not policy, and it was about to cost them their livelihoods. The fuse was lit, and the spark was not a misunderstanding, but contempt. Amara approached the front desk, the small, unsettling observations from the lobby receding as she focused on the task at hand, a quick check-in. The clerk, a young woman named Chelsea, looked up, her expression a careful blankness that quickly hardened into something far less professional. There was no welcoming smile, no practiced deference owed to a potential high roller. There was only scrutiny. Amara offered a reserved smile. Her voice was calm, measured, the tone she reserved for minor corrections. "Good evening. I have a reservation under the owner's preferred listing. Cole." Chelsea paused, one finger hovering over the keyboard. Her eyes didn't meet Amara's. They swept over her tailored suit, then lingered briefly on her hands, devoid of the flashy jewelry Chelsea apparently expected from wealth. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable. "You said, Cole?" Chelsea finally asked, her tone heavy with suspicion, drawing the name out as if testing its authenticity. "Yes. Cole." Amara maintained her composure, but the first flicker of annoyance crossed her mind. This was beyond incompetence. It felt deliberate. It should be listed under the executive reserved profiles. Chelsea typed slowly, deliberately, her gaze fixed on the screen. She frowned, shaking her head almost imperceptibly. "I don't see anything under that name in the executive database, ma'am. Perhaps you need to check the standard booking system." The ma'am sounded less like respect and more like a barely concealed challenge. Amara took a small, steadying breath. This was her first authentic, visceral taste of the brand slippage she had sensed. She knew the listing was unique, encrypted and accessible only by high-level staff. "It is not a standard booking. I assure you, it is there. Try filtering by the priority code, ASC Owner, 77. Chelsea's eyes finally flicked up, a flicker of pure disdain crossing her face. It was the look of someone who had already decided the person speaking was lying, attempting to exploit the system, or simply in the wrong place. She gave a short, dismissive laugh, too soft for anyone else to hear. "Look, I can't access any code like that," Chelsea stated, her voice now louder, firmer, drawing the attention of the older bellman who had been watching. "We don't just hand out keys to owners' preferred profiles. Do you have a confirmation number? Or maybe a company ID?" Amara felt the heat rise in her chest. She had deliberately chosen not to use her company ID to test the system's integrity. Now, that choice had turned into a self-imposed trap. She leaned forward, lowering her voice. "There is no confirmation number. I am simply asking you to check with the duty manager, Mr. Thorne. Tell him Amara Cole is here and needs access to her suite." At the mention of the manager's name, the bellman finally approached, moving with slow, proprietorial authority. His uniform looked slightly too tight, his posture was stiff, marked by ingrained cynicism. "Is there an issue, Chelsea?" the bellman asked, his eyes sweeping over Amara with the same insulting thoroughness as the clerk. Chelsea's relief was immediate. "Mr. David, this lady is trying to get into one of the priority suites without a reservation or ID. She claims to be the owner." The quotation marks were audible in her tone. The two exchanged a glance, a silent, cynical communication that spoke volumes about their shared assumptions. David stepped closer, his shadow falling across the marble counter. He ignored Amara's presence entirely, directing his instructions to Chelsea. "Did you check the no-soliciting list? Sometimes they try to use big names to sneak past security." The words landed like small, sharp stones. No soliciting list. Sneak past security. Amara was no longer a disgruntled guest. She was being framed as a potential trespasser. The outrage was cold and absolute, eclipsing the mere annoyance of a moment ago. This was not a mistake. This was prejudice weaponized by ignorance and complacency. Amara finally spoke, her voice cutting across their quiet conspiracy. I asked to speak to Mr. Thorne. That is the only request I am making now. David finally turned his full attention to her, and the contempt in his eyes was unmistakable. It was the condescending pity reserved for someone he believed had overstepped their bounds. The manager is busy, ma'am. He only speaks to confirmed guests or official business partners. Not just anyone who walks in off the street claiming they own the place. Now, if you'll step aside so we can assist our actual guests. He gestured dismissively toward the lobby entrance. The implication was clear, you do not belong here. You are an imposter. Amara's training, years of maintaining absolute control in high-stakes environments, kicked in. She forced herself to breathe, to measure the exact coordinates of her anger. She could reveal herself right now, in a storm of shouting and accusation, but that would only allow them to spin the story later. She wanted the truth to expose them, not her rage. She decided to play their game, to see how deep the arrogance ran. I understand your policy, Amara stated, her voice dangerously low. But I need access to my belongings now. If you refuse to call the manager, you are leaving me with only one option. David chuckled, a dry, dismissive sound that was instantly recognized by the few other guests watching the quiet scene unfold. And what's that, ma'am? Filing a complaint? Go ahead. But you'll need a reservation number first. He folded his arms, clearly confident that he had one. This was the moment of escalation. The moment where the staff moved from slight rudeness to full-blown refusal of service based on a clear, unstated bias. They believed they were protecting the hotel from fraud because the real owner couldn't possibly look like her. My option, Amara said, her eyes boring into David's, is to call the police. David's smile broadened into a smirk. Go right ahead, ma'am. They know me. We'll be happy to have them escort you off the property for loitering. Chelsea giggled softly behind the desk. The few observing guests quickly looked away, suddenly finding the potted plants immensely interesting. Amara was alone, facing the impenetrable wall of their collective, prejudiced certainty. The bellman reached out a hand, not quite touching her, but the movement was an unmistakable threat. Time to go, ma'am. We can't have this disturbance in the lobby. Amara stood her ground for one more second, feeling the terrible weight of being unseen and unheard in a space she legally owned. The injustice was staggering. She saw the smirk on David's face, the petty triumph in Chelsea's eyes. They were savoring this power. Then, she turned and walked toward the entrance. She didn't hurry, maintaining a slow, deliberate pace that spoke volumes. The bellman watched her go, a satisfied curl on his lip. He had won the small battle, confirming his own prejudices in the process. Amara stepped out of the lobby doors and into the cool evening air. The valet who had been distracted earlier now rushed to open the door for the limousine and its pale, impeccably dressed occupants. For them, the service was instant, invisible, and assumed. She walked straight past her waiting, unmarked car. She walked 50 feet down the street, turned a corner, and stopped beneath the shadow of an adjacent financial building. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out her phone. Her fingers, which had trembled slightly under the glare of the lobby lights, were now steady, moving with the precision of a field commander. She didn't call the police. She didn't call her lawyer. She called one of her most trusted lieutenants, the chief financial officer, a man who had been with the company since its inception. The call was brief, no longer than 45 seconds. Amara spoke 5 simple, devastating phrases. There was no emotion in her voice, only the cold, unyielding command of absolute authority. Initiate the code black. Notify legal. Lock all external communications. Prepare the press release. I want this done in 13 minutes. She hung up, the cool plastic of the phone solid in her hand. She stared back at the illuminated glass facade of her flagship hotel. She hadn't been defeated, she had been given a weapon. Their casual racism, their contempt, had just become the justification for a complete, immediate corporate purge. Amara checked her watch, 12 minutes and 40 seconds remaining. She walked back to the hotel's porte-cochere, ignoring the valet who suddenly noticed her presence and rushed to assist her. She didn't need a door opened. She needed an exit plan for the entire staff. Inside the lobby, David and Chelsea were laughing softly, reliving their small victory over the loitering fraud. They hadn't checked the owner's file, they hadn't called the manager, and they hadn't realized that the moment she walked out, the hotel's entire operating structure began to collapse. Amara paused in the entryway, unseen for a moment by the staff who were busy congratulating themselves. She watched David wipe the faint, satisfied smile from his face as he turned to greet the limousine guests. He bowed slightly, deferential and polite. Amara knew the CFO's team was already executing the plan. Within the next few minutes, the following would happen simultaneously. Digital keycard access for every non-executive staff member would be remotely deactivated. The payroll system would be flagged for immediate severance processing. The HR system would send out a mass termination notice. The clock was ticking down. The staff, immersed in their routine, had no idea that their professional lives were, at that very second, being erased by a few lines of code executed miles away, all because of one look, one dismissal. Amara stepped fully into the lobby again. David and Chelsea looked up, confusion quickly replacing their smugness. Why was she back? Didn't she understand she wasn't welcome? The bellman took one step toward her, ready to repeat his expulsion. But before he could speak, the soft, irritating chime of the front desk computers went off. Not an error, but a system-wide alert. Chelsea frowned, typing furiously. "What is that?" she whispered. Then, the lights in the lobby flickered. Not a power outage, but a momentary surge, a minor digital hiccup signaling a massive system change. David's phone, clipped to his belt, buzzed with an incoming corporate message. His face, seconds ago full of self-assurance, began to turn pale as he read the subject line, urgent, immediate operational cessation. Amara stood perfectly still, watching the slow, agonizing spread of fear as the staff realized that something irreversible was happening. The climax was no longer about an argument over a room key. It was about the swift, brutal consequence of their racial bias, delivered with the cold efficiency of the financial system Amara had mastered. The bellman's hand dropped to his side. Chelsea looked up from the screen, her eyes wide with mounting terror. They had won the battle for the lobby, but the war for their jobs was already lost. The final, defining minutes were about to begin, and Amara was ready to deliver the final blow. The air in the Ascend Hotel lobby had become thick and pressurized, no longer the calm luxury Amara had designed, but a cage vibrating with sudden mutual fear. David, the bellman, still stood halfway to intercepting Amara, his hand frozen mid-gesture. Chelsea, the clerk, stared at her monitor, the screen displaying an unfamiliar corporate shutdown alert blinking with merciless regularity. The limousine guests who had just checked in paused, their elegant conversation dying in their throats. Amara watched the scene unfold with the detached precision of a surgeon. She knew the exact status of the corporate clock. 8 minutes and 32 seconds had passed since her call. The technical part of the purge was complete. Now came the human element, the crushing realization. David finally managed to lower his voice, laced with frantic confusion. "What is this? Is the system down? You can't be in here, ma'am. We need to focus on the guests." His attempt to regain control was weak, crumbling around the edges. Amara took a deliberate step toward the front desk. The valet, now realizing the gravity of the situation, retreated toward the service entrance. All eyes were on her. "The system is not down, Mr. David," Amara stated, her voice slicing through the chaos, betraying none of the intense emotion churning inside her. "The system is functioning exactly as directed." Chelsea let out a small, strangled cry. "My keycard, it won't scan my login. It says access denied. What's happening?" She frantically swiped her personalized keycard, the small electronic reader emitting a sad, repetitive error beep. David, desperate, pulled out his company phone and scrolled through the urgent message he had received. His eyes flew wide as he saw the sender, the CFO's office. The subject line hadn't been an IT alert, it was an official notice of termination. "This is impossible," he whispered, shaking his head. "This has to be a joke. A hack. They can't do this to the entire floor." He looked around wildly, seeking validation from the security guards who were also nervously checking their suddenly silenced radios. Amara reached into her clutch again. This time, she didn't pull out her phone. She pulled out a small metallic object, a silver customized executive access keycard bearing the Ascend insignia and a single engraved initial A. She slid the card into the desk's main terminal reader. Unlike Chelsea's attempt, the reader didn't beep in protest. Instead, the screen flashed green instantly, displaying the complete, encrypted internal dashboard. David and Chelsea instinctively leaned in, desperate to see what level of access this woman possessed. Their faces, pale with mounting dread, contorted further when the computer screen showed a single chilling header: Owner/CEO System Access, Amara Cole. The realization hit them like a physical blow. The woman they had humiliated, dismissed, and threatened with the police was not a trespasser, not a fraud, but the ultimate authority in the building, the owner. But Amara wasn't finished. She moved with purpose to the printer and retrieved a stack of freshly printed papers that had just rolled off the machine, a consequence of the Code Black protocol. She placed the papers precisely on the marble counter, right where David had stood in judgment moments before. These were the individual, personalized termination notices. David stared at the documents, unable to process the truth. "No. You can't be. You were just outside. Why didn't you say anything?" His voice was hoarse, tinged not with anger, but with overwhelming panic. Amara finally looked him in the eye, her gaze cold and unwavering. "I wasn't outside, Mr. David. I was the owner observing a critical failure of management and ethics in my own property." She paused, letting the words settle like lead. "And when I requested to speak to Mr. Thorne, your response was to categorize me as a loitering fraud and threaten me with arrest." The humiliation they had inflicted on her was now being returned, magnified 100-fold, with the cold, unfeeling power of a legal document. Amara pointed to the thickest stack of papers, the termination notices for the front of house, security, and administrative staff who had either participated in or ignored the incident. "You asked what my final option was," Amara continued, addressing the silent lobby. "It wasn't calling the police. It was enforcing the zero-tolerance clause against racial bias and discriminatory practice, a clause I wrote into every corporate contract." She picked up a black, heavy-bodied pen. This was the moment of ultimate, crushing power. She signed the top document, the termination letter for David, with a swift, clean stroke. The scratch of the pen on the heavy paper sounded deafening in the silent lobby. David's breath hitched. His eyes, wide with sheer terror, pleaded silently for mercy. All the arrogance was gone, replaced by a desperate, sickening vulnerability. "You can't do this to the entire staff over one misunderstanding," Chelsea whispered, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "We need these jobs." "It was not a misunderstanding," Amara corrected, her tone devoid of warmth. "It was contempt. And contempt, rooted in prejudice, is a terminal disease for a hospitality brand. You judged me based on my skin, not my status, and in doing so, you proved you are unfit to represent the standards of the Ascend Group." She signed the stack of papers with the rapid rhythmic force of an executive executing a hostile takeover. Each scratch of the pen was a final verdict on the career of a staff member who had made a prejudiced assumption. The climax reached its emotional peak as David finally sank to his knees, not from physical exhaustion, but from the sudden catastrophic realization of his own foolishness. He saw the end of his income, the destruction of his career, all stemming from one moment of casual racism. He tried to speak, to beg, but no sound came out. The manager, Mr. Thorne, finally rushed out of his office, alerted by the chaos and the system alerts. He saw Amara, the owner, standing over the kneeling bellman, a pen in her hand and a stack of signed papers on the desk. He saw the terror on his staff's faces and the cold finality on Amara's. He didn't need an explanation. He turned and walked back into his office, knowing his own termination notice would follow soon. Amara lowered the pen, her hand steady. The entire purge, the judgment, the consequence, the realization, had taken less than 13 minutes. She looked at David, still kneeling, the weight of his decision crushing him. She hadn't sought revenge. She had sought justice delivered with the same cold, unforgiving speed of the financial markets she controlled. "Your belongings will be secured and shipped to your residence," Amara announced, speaking to the entire shattered staff. "Security will escort you off the property now. This hotel will be closed for 48 hours for a complete ethical restructure." Amara picked up the stack of signed papers and walked away from the front desk, past the stunned guests, and toward the elevator. She had faced the casual cruelty of prejudice. She had retaliated with the devastating efficiency of a CEO protecting her empire. As the elevator doors began to slide shut, She looked out at the frozen faces of the staff, their humiliation complete, their livelihoods gone. The silence was absolute. The last thing the viewer sees before the doors close is the look of total gut-wrenching shock on David's face as he finally understands the price of his contempt. The elevator doors closed, sealing Amara Cole in silence. Below her, the lobby was a tomb of shattered careers and sudden, brutal self-reflection. She didn't look at the flashing emergency messages on the internal panel. She didn't celebrate. Instead, a profound heaviness settled over her. The bitter reality of the cost quickly replaced the sweet taste of vindication. She had won, yes, but the victory felt hollow. To enforce a basic standard of respect, she had been forced to deploy the ultimate financial weapon, a mass termination. She had stripped away the livelihoods of an entire team, not because of incompetence, but because of a prejudice so casual, so deeply ingrained, that they felt comfortable wielding it against a stranger in their workplace. That was the true tragedy. Amara reached the top floor and stepped into her penthouse suite. It was quiet, luxurious, and perfectly appointed. It was everything the Ascend brand promised. Yet, the air felt charged with the injustice of the interaction that had just occurred. She walked to the floor-to-ceiling window and looked out at the glittering, indifferent city. She saw her reflection, a powerful, successful black woman who, just minutes ago, had been reduced to a suspicious loiterer. This wasn't just about a key card or a room. It was about the invisible contract of respect that successful black professionals carry every day. It's the silent understanding that wealth, authority, and achievement can be erased in a single moment by the subjective, prejudiced gaze of someone who believes they hold the true power. She thought of David, kneeling in the lobby, his face crumpled with realization. She hadn't seen remorse for his bias. She had seen terror over his lost stability. The lesson had been delivered, but had it been learned? That remained the haunting question. Over the next 48 hours, the story leaked. Not just the terminations, but the reason for them. The internet exploded. People who had only seen the polished surface of the Ascend group were now forced to reckon with the ugliness beneath. Some hailed Amara as a hero, a symbol of absolute authority fighting back against the enemy. Others condemned her as ruthless, arguing that no mistake justified the firing of an entire staff. Amara ignored both the praise and the criticism. She focused on the impact. Her action wasn't merely a matter of corporate discipline. It was a loud, definitive statement to the entire hospitality industry. It was a declaration that contempt has a price. It sent a clear message to every employee across her properties, and perhaps across the country. The culture of disrespect, microaggression, and casual racial dismissal would no longer be tolerated under her watch. The hotel reopened with a new manager, a completely new staff, and a mandated zero-tolerance ethics training program. The new culture was defined by professionalism and genuine respect, a direct response to the ethical vacuum Amara had found. But the emotional closure wasn't just found in the corporate overhaul. Amara found it later that week, reviewing the security footage of the incident. She watched herself standing at the desk, composed yet under attack. She watched the moment David smirked and threatened her. And she watched herself walk out, only to return minutes later, carrying the weight of the financial system as her shield. The lasting impact of the incident wasn't the fear, it was the resolve. Amara realized that the battle against prejudice often requires more than just excellence. It sometimes requires the cold, undeniable power of consequence. She had spent years proving her worth. Now, she had used that worth to dismantle a system of prejudice that thought it was safe. This is the more profound truth of Amara's story. For many, wealth and success offer a shield against racial discrimination. But for people of color, that shield is often temporary, invisible, and easily pierced by the audacity of bias. Amara's response was a rare opportunity to turn that shield into a weapon of correction. She didn't just fire a staff member. She used her position to force a highly public reckoning, demonstrating that the power held by a privileged few can be devastatingly overturned when confronted with the absolute, unyielding authority of actual ownership and ethics. The story of the black CEO and the 13 minutes that changed an entire hotel is a powerful reminder that while racism persists, accountability can be swift, absolute, and financially ruinous. It forces us to ask, what happens when the person you dismiss is the one who holds the power to change your world? The staff members learned the hard way that day. Contempt is a contract you pay for, not a privilege you earn. We watch stories like this and feel the shock, the anger, and the triumph. But what happens in our own daily lives, in the moments without cameras and without a CEO's checkbook? Share. Click that share button and get this video to every person who needs to understand the cost